freedom feels light. Until responsibility arrives. Most people run from responsibility, thinking it limits them. But without it, freedom collapses into confusion. True freedom does not remove weight. It gives meaning to carrying it. Only those who accept responsibility discover what freedom actually is. In Iqbal's vision, responsibility is not burden. It is alignment. The moment the self accepts responsibility, freedom gains direction, and life begins to take shape with purpose. Today, we continue our journey through Asrar Khudi, Allama Iqbal's exploration of the self. This is episode 44. Settle your mind. Let responsibility reveal its deeper meaning. Responsibility is often misunderstood as burden. But responsibility is not weight. It is alignment. When the self accepts responsibility, it steps into authorship of its own life. The self learns that responsibility is not imposed. It is awakened. It arises the moment the self recognizes its power to choose. The self understands that responsibility transforms freedom into purpose. Freedom without responsibility scatters. Responsibility without freedom suffocates. Together, they create direction. The self realizes that responsibility clarifies identity. Without it, the self drifts. With it, the self stands rooted. The self sees that responsibility is not obligation. It is ownership. Ownership of action. Ownership of consequence. Ownership of becoming. The self learns that responsibility begins internally. External control fades. Internal command strengthens. Strength guided inwardly creates stability outwardly. The self understands that responsibility is the bridge between intention and impact. Intent without responsibility dissolves. Impact without responsibility destroys. Balance sustains growth. The self recognizes that responsibility sharpens awareness. Awareness invites accountability. Accountability refines judgment. The self sees that responsibility anchors freedom. Freedom unanchored drifts into chaos. Anchored freedom moves with purpose. The self learns that responsibility matures the will guided by awareness, acts with precision. Precision prevents harm. The self understands that responsibility is self-respect in action. Self-respect ignored weakens resolve. Self-respect lived strengthens character. The self realizes that responsibility creates reliability. Reliability builds trust. Trust deepens connection. The self sees that responsibility protects against self-deception. Self-deception thrives in avoidance. Responsibility exposes truth. The self learns. That responsibility trains the self to think beyond immediate desire. Desire unchecked shortens vision. Vision extended creates foresight. The self understands. That responsibility forms moral structure. Structure sustains coherence. Coherence supports identity. The self recognizes. That responsibility allows growth. Without chaos, chaos disrupts. Responsibility orders. The self sees. That responsibility is not limitation. It is expansion with direction. Direction enables progress. The self learns. That responsibility clarifies values. Values tested by action become real. The self understands. That responsibility deepens commitment. Commitment lived shapes destiny. The self realizes. That responsibility awakens leadership. Leadership begins when one stops waiting to be led. The self sees. That responsibility invites maturity. Maturity stabilizes life. Stability fosters trust. The self understands. That responsibility is a form of courage. Courage to stand behind one's actions. Courage to face consequence. The self recognizes. That responsibility anchors meaning. Meaning sustained gives life weight. The self sees. That responsibility transforms the self from passenger to pilot. Direction chosen determines journey. The self understands. Responsibility is the moment. The self stops asking, "What will happen to me?" and begins asking, "What will I make of this?" The self begins to understand. That responsibility does not shrink freedom. It gives freedom weight. Weight grounds movement. Grounded movement creates direction. The self learns. That responsibility requires presence. Presence prevents escape. Escape delays growth. The self understands. That responsibility calls the self into maturity. Maturity is not age. It is alignment between choice and consequence. The self sees. That responsibility trains awareness. Awareness reveals impact. Impact accepted strengthens character. The self realizes. That responsibility shapes integrity. Integrity without responsibility remains ideal. Responsibility lived becomes integrity embodied. The self learns. That responsibility organizes desire. Desire without structure consumes. Structure transforms desire into purpose. The self understands. That responsibility refines judgment. Judgment guided by awareness protects against harm. The self sees. That responsibility teaches patience. Patience sustains effort. When results delay, the self recognizes. That responsibility resists blame. Blame weakens agency. Agency empowers action. The self learns. That responsibility deepens accountability. Accountability accepted builds trust. Trust stabilizes relationships. The self understands. That responsibility is inseparable from freedom. Freedom exercised without care erodes itself. Care preserves liberty. The self realizes. That responsibility is a practice. Practice daily. It strengthens resolve. Neglected. It weakens discipline. The self sees. That responsibility requires honesty. Honesty confronts discomfort. Discomfort builds resilience. The self learns. That responsibility cultivates foresight. Foresight prevents regret. Regret avoided preserves peace. The self understands. That responsibility anchors ambition. Ambition without anchor drifts into excess. Anchored ambition builds sustainably. The self recognizes. That responsibility fosters humility. Humility invites learning. Learning expands capacity. The self sees. That responsibility creates inner authority. Authority rooted internally does not seek dominance. The self learns. That responsibility sustains long-term growth. Growth rushed collapses. Growth sustained endures. The self understands. That responsibility guards against temptation. Temptation clouds judgment. Responsibility restores clarity. The self realizes. That responsibility enhances freedom's quality. Quality matters more than quantity. Quality endures. The self sees. That responsibility teaches discernment. Discernment prevents misdirection. Misdirection wastes energy. The self understands. That responsibility shapes destiny. Through everyday choice. Small decisions accumulate. Accumulation defines life. The self recognizes. That responsibility demands courage. Courage faces consequence. Consequence teaches wisdom. The self sees. That responsibility creates stability. Stability enables creativity. Creativity fuels progress. The self learns. That responsibility honors truth. Truth lived grounds the self. The self understands. That responsibility reveals maturity. Maturity steadies the soul. Steady souls endure. The self realizes. That responsibility deepens meaning. Meaning earned lasts beyond circumstance. The self sees. That responsibility is a commitment to conscious living. Conscious living awakens purpose. The self understands. That responsibility transforms intention into reality. Reality shaped becomes legacy. There comes a moment when the self realizes that responsibility is not a burden carried alone. It is a dialogue between intention and consequence, a conversation that shapes character. The self understands that responsibility awakens dignity. Dignity grows when actions reflect inner truth. Truth lived strengthens the self quietly. The self realizes that responsibility creates coherence. Coherence between thought and action eliminates inner conflict. Conflict resolved restores clarity. The self sees that responsibility requires steadiness. Steadiness resists impulse. Impulse fades. Purpose remains. The self understands that responsibility matures the heart. A mature heart chooses depth over distraction. Depth sustains meaning. The self learns that responsibility invites self-respect. Self-respect nurtured becomes inner authority. Authority anchored guides without force. The self recognizes that responsibility is the ground of trust. Trust built inwardly radiates outward. Outward trust strengthens connection. The self sees that responsibility tempers ambition. Ambition without restraint burns out. Restraint fuels longevity. The self understands that responsibility refines motivation. Motivation purified aligns effort with values. Values honored stabilize identity. The self realizes that responsibility requires courage to remain consistent. Consistency resists distraction. Distraction weakens purpose. The self sees that responsibility nurtures patience. Patience allows growth to unfold naturally. Forced growth fractures. The self understands that responsibility deepens awareness of consequence. Consequences anticipated guide wise action. The self learns that responsibility is not perfection. It is commitment to improvement. Improvement pursued keeps the self evolving. The self recognizes that responsibility strengthens presence. Presence grounded invites clarity. Clarity directs action. The self sees that responsibility shapes character quietly. Character built slowly endures pressure. The self understands that responsibility aligns inner life with outer action. Alignment reduces friction. Reduced friction increases flow. The self realizes that responsibility gives freedom meaning. Freedom without meaning drifts. Meaning anchors freedom. The self sees that responsibility calls for perseverance. Perseverance deepens resolve. Resolve sustains effort. The self understands. That responsibility anchors the self. In reality, reality embraced becomes ground for growth. The self realizes. That responsibility fosters inner peace. Peace arises when actions and values align. The self sees. That responsibility teaches humility. Humility opens learning. Learning deepens wisdom. The self understands. That responsibility is not a weight. It is a path. A path walked consciously leads to mastery. The self realizes. That responsibility shapes destiny through daily choice. Choice repeated becomes character. Character becomes fate. The self understands. That responsibility is the quiet strength that holds life together. And through responsibility, the self becomes worthy of its freedom.